Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to our weekly Explained series. Under this Explained initiative, we take an important current affairs topic from the last 1 week and discuss it in complete detail so that you have a comprehensive understanding of these important topics for both your prelims and mains. So do support the Explained initiative by liking the video, share these videos with fellow aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. The topic for today's Explained is the I2U2 Summit that was held last week. It's an important topic under international relations, very important for both your prelims and mains. So today, you'll understand all about the I2U2 Summit. First, we'll discuss why the topic was in news. We'll understand what is I2U2, which are the countries that are part of this grouping, what is the agenda in front of this grouping known as I2U2. We'll also talk about its significance in geopolitics and understand its relevance for India. We'll also carry out a critical analysis at the end to discuss the advantages and disadvantages for Indian foreign policy by being part of this initiative known as the I2U2 initiative. So let's begin our discussion by first talking about why the topic was in news. Last week, on the 14th of July, the first I2U2 summit was held. It was a virtual summit that took place. It was a virtual online summit that was held between the leaders of 4 important countries. I2U2 is an acronym. If you expand it, it stands for India, Israel, UAE, and the United States of America. I2 refers to India and Israel over here. And U2 refers to UAE, a very important country in the West Asia region, along with the United States of America. So these 4 countries have come together to form this mini-lateral grouping. Essentially, it's a multilateral platform where these 4 countries are interacting. It's often referred to, any such small multilateral groupings, they are often referred to as mini-lateral initiatives. So these 4 like-minded countries, which have common interests, common objectives, they have come together to form this grouping called I2U2, which will focus on the West Asia region. It will focus on bringing these 4 countries together, especially in the economic domain. And they're also looking to step up their cooperation in the strategic domain. So economic cooperation and strategic cooperation is the primary focus of I2U2. India, US, UAE, and Israel. These 4 countries, they have a number of common objectives. They have a lot of common interests as far as West Asian geopolitics are concerned. So keeping these common interests in mind, these 4 countries have come together to form this mini-lateral or multilateral grouping called the I2U2 initiative. Informally, in the media and even strategic experts, they are referring to this as the West Asian Quad or the West Asian version of the quadrilateral. I'm sure you would be familiar with another grouping called the Quad or the quadrilateral, which is focused on the Indo-Pacific region, focused on the eastern part of the world. Even we have covered the quadrilateral in many of our other initiatives. For example, under Knowledge series, we have had a separate discussion on the Quad grouping. The Quad or the quadrilateral that's focused on the Indo-Pacific is focused on the eastern part of the world, and it brings together India along with Japan, Australia, and United States. These 4 like-minded democracies, which are major players in the Indo-Pacific, they have come together to form the Quad or the quadrilateral, mainly to focus on China, mainly to counter Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific region. The main objective of the Quad, that is the main objective of India, Japan, Australia, and US as part of this grouping, is to promote a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, to ensure that international laws and rules are followed in the Indo-Pacific, to keep the Indo-Pacific free and open in order to protect their economic and strategic interests. Because in the Indo-Pacific, China is being very aggressive with regard to its maritime disputes, especially in the South China Sea, and it has violated international law and it has threatened freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. It has disrupted the free and open nature of the Indo-Pacific. So with this primary intention in mind, India, Japan, Australia, US, they came together to form the Quad or the Quadrilateral. This initiative was the brainchild of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was even recently assassinated. So something on similar lines is happening in West Asia as well. According to several experts, China's influence in West Asia is also growing, and China is becoming a significant economic and strategic power across the West Asia region. This affects the interests of other major powers in West Asia, which includes US, UAE, and as well as India, and of course Israel as well. Now these four countries, they have certain common interests, they have common economic and even strategic interests. So with the intention of retaining their influence and with the intention of further promoting their economic ties and strategic ties, and also to possibly counter Chinese influence, another version of the Quad has been formed in West Asia according to certain experts. But the countries themselves, they're not referring to this as the West Asian Quad. They've even dismissed any such reports. But however, within the US government, certain top officials, they have referred to the I2U2 as a possible version of the West Asian Quad. Just like there is a Quad towards the eastern part of the world focusing on the Indo-Pacific and Chinese aggression, possibly this new initiative called I2U2 could become the West Asian version of the Quad. So that is why this topic is so very important. The first summit of I2U2 was held last week, and all the leaders of these countries, they interacted virtually. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he interacted with his counterparts from US, Israel, and UAE. So many key initiatives were announced. The vision of I2U2 was laid out. The vision and agenda of this grouping was laid out, along with launching few important initiatives. So in this session, we are going to analyze all the key facts and details about I2U2. We'll talk about its origins. We'll understand what drives these four countries to come together. What does India have to gain from this initiative? And we'll also evaluate the complex geopolitics of West Asia, which is bringing these four countries together. That is going to be the core part of our discussion. If you examine the origins of this grouping, if you go back to October 2021, that is last year, the first step was taken towards the establishment of this group called the I2U2. The foreign ministers of these four countries, including India's foreign minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, they held a meeting last year when India's foreign minister was on a visit to Israel. Last year in October, India's foreign minister paid an important visit to Israel. During the same time, the foreign ministers of UAE and the Secretary of State of US were also present in Israel. They all met, they interacted, they discussed their common issues and concerns, and they launched a grouping which was then called the International Forum for Economic Cooperation. This was the initial setup that was created to bring these four countries together to focus on the West Asia region. The agenda was to focus on the geopolitics of West Asia and also to focus on the geoeconomics of West Asia. The idea was to bring these four countries together economically, to promote close economic initiatives between these four countries with primary focus on West Asia and West Asian geopolitics. So the groundwork was laid last year in October 2021 when the foreign ministers of these four countries met and interacted. They held the International Forum for Economic Cooperation, which became the foundation on which now the I2U2 platform has been created. The very same platform has been transformed into the I2U2 initiative, that is India, Israel, UAE and US. And at the summit level, that is at the level of prime ministers and presidents, a summit has taken place and the agenda of the group has been clearly laid out and clearly defined. So it's in this context that we need to examine what does India gain from being part of this initiative? What is India's equation with the other members of I2U2? What kind of equation do the other countries have with each other? What is this common interest that I'm talking about? What are these common objectives that brings these four countries together? If you understand that and understand a little about West Asian geopolitics, you'll understand the significance of the establishment of this initiative. See, as you know, India already has fantastic relations with all the other three countries. Especially in the last 20 years, India's ties with US has really improved, right? Whatever hostilities we had in the past during the Cold War era, those hostilities have been kept aside ever since India-US signed the nuclear deal, the civil nuclear deal, back in 2004. Since then, India-US have become very close strategic partners. They have started collaborating in the field of counter-terrorism, intelligence sharing, and as well as in the field of defense cooperation. India has procured a number of advanced military equipment, defense platforms from the US. Both countries have been holding a number of joint military exercises. They are collaborating in the field of cybersecurity as well. Plus, there is very strong economic and cultural relationship that has been driving the India-US relations. So today, India-US, the world's two largest democracies, they have truly built a partnership based on trust and friendship, and they've created a partnership which has become the defining partnership of the century. Because the world's largest democracy has come together with the world's oldest democracy. Both the countries have tremendous potential to define the future of the Indo-Pacific. So in the last 20 years, India-US have come really close to each other in every possible domain. You look at the defense trade between the two countries. Look at the strategic ties and initiatives between them. The maritime security initiatives, the military exercises, right? Look at the collaboration the two countries have in the field of counter-terrorism and intelligence sharing. Take a look at the collaboration between India-US in the field of technology, education, healthcare, even space cooperation, climate change, and as well as in the field of clean and renewable energy. So across these domains, India-US have built a strategic partnership in the last 20 years. So this is what makes India and US, the India-US partnership, the defining partnership of the century. So without a doubt, India-US are very close to each other despite the minor issues they have. They share a very, very close equation with each other. On similar lines, India has very, very good bilateral relations with the other members of I2U2 as well. India shares an excellent rapport and excellent equation with Israel and UAE. In the past, that is before 1992, India did have a complex equation with Israel. We are going to evaluate that in more detail in the coming slides. Between 1950s and 1992, for around 40 years, for around 4 decades, India did have a very complex equation with Israel. But in the last 30 years, especially in the last 20 years, India-Israel relations have really improved across different domains with main focus on defense relations. Today, Israel has become one of the top defense suppliers for India. In fact, after Russia, Israel and then US, they happen to be the top suppliers of military equipment and hardware to India. Israel happens to be the second biggest supplier of arms and weapons, and US happens to be the third biggest supplier of arms and weapons. So again, in the field of defense relations, counter-terrorism, intelligence sharing, and also in the field of agriculture, science and technology, space cooperation, etc. Across these fields, India-Israel have built a very close strategic partnership over the last 25 to 30 years. India-Israel work very closely when it comes to countering terrorism, when it comes to sharing intelligence with each other. We even work very closely in the cybersecurity domain. The economic relations also have improved, and we have a significant trading relationship with Israel as of today. India has sourced many critical weapon platforms from Israeli companies, from Israeli armed forces. And we have extended this cooperation into the civilian domain as well, where we are collaborating with Israel in various fields, including healthcare, pandemic management, vaccine development, science and technology in general, biotechnology, and also in the field of agriculture. Israel is seen as a leader in several technologies. For example, with technologies such as desalination, with technologies such as drought-resistant farming. As Israel is located in a desert and faces a critical shortage of water, it has pioneered these technologies, these water-saving, water management technologies. Israel is a pioneer in drip irrigation. It's a leader in smart agriculture. It has developed these crops, these genetically modified crops, which have very good productivity even with limited water supply. Basically, drought-resistant farming has been specialized by Israeli industries and Israeli companies. Israel specializes in desalination, in converting seawater, saline water into potable water. So in all these areas, India has a lot to learn from Israel, and we are working very closely with each other. These countries also stand to gain by working with India. India is a huge market for them, a massive market for US, for Israel, and of course for UAE, right? India is also a leader in various fields of technology. With regard to pharmaceuticals, for example, with regard to production of drugs and vaccines, India is a global leader. India is emerging as a hub of innovation and technology. India has become a hub of tech-based startups. And today, India is not just providing manpower, technical manpower to other countries, but Indian companies are also investing in these countries today. Our IT firms, for example, are investing in Israel and US. They are creating jobs in those countries. So there is very close collaboration between India and Israel as well, just like we have a strategic partnership between India and US. You will see the same equation with UAE as well, the other major power in West Asia. In West Asia, both Israel and UAE are very important powers. UAE, the United Arab Emirates, happens to be an Arab state, an Arab country. It's a Sunni country, part of the Sunni power bloc. You might have heard that in West Asia, there is a regional rivalry that goes on. There is very intense regional rivalry. In West Asia, if you look at West Asian geopolitics, on one side you have the Sunni power bloc, the Sunni states led by Saudi Arabia, along with UAE and other Sunni powers like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, etc. All these are the Sunni power states. They represent the Sunni power bloc. They have intense rivalry with the Shia powers, the Shia states, the Shia power bloc led by Iran, that also includes countries like Syria, Lebanon, and the others. Then you have Israel, which happens to be another critical power of West Asia region, along with Turkey, which is also very interested in playing a key role in West Asian geopolitics. So there is intense competition and rivalry between these different power blocs. The Sunni states on one side, led by Saudi Arabia and UAE. The Shia powers led by Iran on the other side. Then Israel, having its own interests and rivalries with the Arab states, the Arab Muslim countries, especially over the Palestinian issue. And along with that, you have Turkey, which follows its own independent foreign policy, which tries to emerge as a regional leader of the Muslim world. So there is intense competition and rivalry between these different power blocs, and India has always tried to find a balance between them. So despite this complicated equation that exists in West Asia, India has built a very close relationship with UAE, especially in the last 10 to 13 years. In the last 13 years, India's ties with UAE and even with Saudi Arabia, it has really transformed. There has been a radical transformation. Generally, if you go back in time, if you go back to, let's say, 1990s or early 2000, you will see that the Sunni power states, they were largely aligned with Pakistan on several critical issues like Kashmir or terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, etc. Saudi Arabia, UAE and the others, they were often seen to be taking a pro-Pakistan stand, and they would not hesitate to take a stand against India. That was the kind of difficult equation we had with Saudi and UAE. But this has changed dramatically in the last 13 years, especially from 2009 to 2010. There has been a huge shift that has happened where the Sunni power countries are looking up to India as a key partner, as a key economic and strategic partner, and they've started taking a pro-India position on several critical matters that really matter to India. On issues like sensitive issues like Kashmir, on issues of counter-terrorism, on issues of Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism. In all these areas, UAE and Saudi Arabia, they have not hesitated to take a stand against Pakistan in favor of India in the last few years. So this is a dramatic shift, a dramatic transformation that has happened. So this transformation was possible because of the strategic relations that started developing between India and the Sunni power world, the Sunni power bloc in West Asia. Our ties with Saudi Arabia really improved. Defense relations, intelligence sharing, counter-terrorism, and this naturally translated into better economic relations as well. And of course, it's a fact that since many decades, India is heavily dependent on West Asia for its energy security. And most of these countries were supplying crude oil and gas to India. So India was always a big trading partner for them, right? We had a critical dependency on these countries, and we further built upon this. Plus, these countries, they are home to a large Indian population. They have a very strong Indian diaspora community. Across West Asia, there are close to 9 to 10 million Indians, or even more than that. And this Indian community represents a strong cultural connection. The Indian workers who reside and who stay and who work in these countries, they form the backbone of these economies. They form a strong cultural bond as well. And this naturally gave India an increasing leverage with changing times and with changing geopolitics. So in the last 14-15 years, you will see that there has been a big shift that Saudi Arabia and UAE have shown towards India. Previously, it was just a transactional relationship, a relationship where India was just importing oil and being dependent on these countries. But today, a more equal partnership has emerged because of the diversification of ties between India and these Sunni powers of the West Asia region. India, Saudi Arabia, and India, UAE. Right? On both the sides, India diversified the relationship. These countries also responded because they saw a massive market in India. They saw that India was a big investment destination as India was registering tremendous economic growth. These West Asian countries, which have sold oil for years and years, right? They happen to be very rich autocratic nations. They are sitting on huge piles of foreign exchange, and they would like to invest that money, the petrodollars, into economies like India, into fast-growing economies like India. So naturally, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they saw India as partner, as an equal partner, as an investment destination, and as an attractive market. Along with this, the US and India relationship, the US-Israel relationship, as it was getting stronger, this also pushed Saudi Arabia, UAE to get closer towards India. Because since the last 30-40 years, US, Israel, then Saudi Arabia and UAE, they've all been aligned together. They are in fact very close allies of each other. US, Israel, Saudi Arabia and UAE, they've all been very close allies of each other, having similar geopolitical objectives and a common enemy in the form of Iran. All these countries that we are talking about, they have intense hostility with Iran. So since US and Israel got closer to India, it became easier for Saudi Arabia and UAE as well to open up towards India. So what we have seen is that in the last 13-14 years, there has been a dramatic shift that has happened in India's favor. So our defense and strategic relations improved with Saudi Arabia and UAE, because Saudi Arabia is seen as the leader of the Sunni world, and generally UAE follows what Saudi Arabia does. So as our ties improved, as our defense and strategic relations improved, our economic relations also started growing. The Indian diaspora started playing a bigger role in the relations that India had with these countries. So this is getting reflected today in the close India-UAE relationship as well. Recently, earlier this year, in 2022, just a few months back, India-UAE signed an important free trade agreement. Some of you might have read about this in newspapers, you would have seen this in current affairs, that India-UAE signed a historic comprehensive economic partnership agreement. Through this free trade agreement, they are further looking to boost their bilateral trade, and they have a long-term vision to reduce and completely eliminate the import tariffs, the import duties. They basically want to put in place a duty-free mechanism for most imports and exports so that it will boost the bilateral trade between India and UAE. Is that clear? This will immensely benefit India's exports to UAE. It will also benefit India's imports from UAE. India-UAE already have a very strong bilateral trading relationship. The UAE is already a very big investor in India. It is investing in many big projects, especially in infrastructure projects and oil projects. The UAE has already invested billions of dollars in our country. So the two countries, they want to take this relationship forward, and they've recently signed a free trade agreement, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, that would exponentially increase the bilateral trading volume. This would make UAE a very important economic and trading partner for India. So it's totally natural for these four countries to come together, to align together, and to form this new initiative called I2U2. Because they already have so much in common. India already has a great equation with all the other three countries. And like I said, these three have already been allies of each other. US, Israel and UAE, they've always been very close allies geopolitically and also with regard to the economic equations of the region. They all share common enmity and rivalry with Iran, these three countries. So since they have such common objectives, common agendas, it was only natural for them to come together and form this new platform where they can collaborate and further increase their influence across West Asia. But until recently, this was not possible. Until recently, such an alignment between these four countries was not possible, especially because of the divide between Israel and the Arab countries. This is where you need a little bit of background about the geopolitical divide between Israel and the Arab Muslim world. This divide goes all the way back to the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian state, which was never created because of Israel's aggression back in 1940s. Here you just need a brief background to understand the importance of this geopolitical divide. See, even though Israel and UAE have been close, they never had formal diplomatic relations. Until 2020, Israel and United Arab Emirates, they publicly did not have diplomatic ties. Officially or formally, they did not recognize each other. The UAE wouldn't recognize Israel as a legitimate country, as an independent nation. Officially did not have diplomatic ties with Israel. But whatever close relations they had, it was a secret relationship, a covert relationship, where Saudi Arabia and UAE, they had opened up to Israel under American influence. From 1980s itself, these four are very close. They have been working together, but secretly. But formally, in the public domain, Saudi Arabia and UAE, they were not acknowledging their ties with Israel. In fact, even today, Saudi Arabia still does not have official ties with Israel. If you ask why, if this sounds very confusing, and if you ask why, the answer to this question lies in the complexity created by the Palestinian issue. See, back in 1940s, that is, if you go back to 1947, according to the UN division plan, two separate states were supposed to be created, one for the Jews and one for the Palestinian Muslims, right? So there was supposed to be an independent state of Israel that you can see in the map over here, and there was supposed to be an independent state for the Palestinians, comprising of these areas, the areas that are shaded in green, which is the West Bank region, including Jerusalem, the holy city of Jerusalem, along with the Gaza Strip that you see over here that faces the Mediterranean Sea. These green shaded areas were supposed to be the Palestinian state, which would be a separate independent country for Palestinian Muslims. The areas shaded in purple would be the independent nation of Israel, which would be an exclusive state for the Jews. This was seen as the ideal solution to resolve the conflict between the Jews and the Palestinian Muslims. But the UN plan was never implemented. The two-state solution, the idea of creating two independent states side by side, this two-state solution was never implemented because Israel broke the agreement. It violated the UN plan, declared unilateral independence, and as a result, it triggered the Arab countries, the Arab Muslim nations, which came to the defense of Palestine. Because as soon as Israel declared independence, it went on to occupy the Palestinian areas and territories and denied Palestinians the opportunity to form their own country. It denied them the right of their own self-determination. So to protect the Palestinians and to protect their right, the Arab Muslim nations, all the Arab Muslim countries, they forgot the Shia-Sunni sectarian divide. From countries including Iran to Saudi Arabia, Turkey to many other Muslim countries in North Africa, they all came together, took a united stand against Israel. So countries from Morocco in North Africa to all the way to Oman, to Iran, to Turkey, all these Muslim nations in the Arab world and in North Africa, they took a common position. They all took a stand against Israel, and many of these Arab Muslim countries, they declared war against Israel. In 1948, after Israel had declared independence, these countries went to war with Israel to liberate Palestine and to protect the Palestinian rights. But eventually they lost the war. Israel, which was backed by the Western countries, fought back and defeated the Arab countries, including Egypt, the then Transjordan, which was there over here, and Syria, and all the other Arab Muslim nations. This war, led by the Arab Muslim world, was backed by Saudi Arabia, UAE, and all the Muslim nations. The Shia-Sunni sectarian divide had been forgotten. It had been kept aside to jointly oppose the Jewish state and the Western agenda. So since then, there was intense rivalry between Israel and all the Arab Muslim countries. No Arab Muslim country recognized Israel. None of these countries, they even recognized Israel as an independent nation. So as a result, they didn't have any formal ties or formal diplomatic relations with Israel. But eventually, geopolitics started changing. These countries which had fought the war against Israel, they went to war again in 1967. They went to war again, and this time, the Arab Muslim nations were once again defeated by Israel. Countries like Egypt lost the war, and Israel even occupied Egyptian territory, including the Sinai desert you see over here. The Sinai Peninsula of Egypt was captured by Israel. All the Arab Muslim countries again suffered defeat in the Six-Day War, the 1967 war. And as a result, the hostilities continued again. But after this, the US would intervene in 1980s, in late 1970s and 1980s. The United States would intervene on behalf of Israel and use this opportunity as a leverage to push Egypt to give up its rivalry with Israel. Since Egyptian territory was captured by Israel, the Sinai desert was occupied by Israel, this became a leverage for Israel. So US used the opportunity to push Israel and Egypt for talks, and this ended with the Camp David Accords that was signed in 1979. Through the Camp David Accords, peace was established between Israel and Egypt. Until then, Egypt was opposed to Israel. It was not recognizing Israel. Egypt was trying to fight for Palestinian rights. But now that it lost its territory to Israel, and since Israel had the edge, it had the leverage, Egypt agreed because of US mediation to recognize Israel and establish ties with Israel. In return, the Sinai Peninsula, which was occupied, was given back to Egypt. So with this, Egypt became the first Muslim nation in this region to recognize Israel as a country and to establish diplomatic ties. So since then, Egypt and Israel became friends, and Egypt became an ally of the US. The next country, the next Muslim country in the region to recognize Israel was Jordan. Jordan was the next country. This was much later in 1994. Jordan also was under significant pressure. Israel was having a clear edge over Jordan. It had captured some territories. And through the mediation of US again, Jordan finally recognized Israel in 1994. So Jordan became the second Arab Muslim nation to recognize Israel and establish ties with Israel. During this period, by 1970s itself, Saudi Arabia, UAE and all the others, they all became close allies of US. Because of the growing oil trade between the Western countries and the West Asian powers, US and Saudi Arabia became very close friends. As Saudi Arabia leads the Sunni Muslim world, it brought along with it all the other countries including UAE, and they started secretly aligning with each other. Around the same period, in 1979, in Iran, there was a revolution that happened. Through the Iranian Revolution, the pro-Western government was overthrown and Shia radicals captured power in the country. So since then, Iran became a strong opponent of the Sunni powers. Now the Sunni autocracies, the Sunni autocratic states led by Saudi Arabia, UAE, they all panicked because Iran had become a Shia country. It had come into the hands of Shia radical clerics who had deep enmity with the Sunni states. So this was a common factor that pushed these Sunni powers of West Asia towards US and Israel. So what they did was they aligned with each other, they forgot their rivalry, but officially they didn't recognize Israel or establish ties with Israel, but they secretly started working together. Because now they had a common enemy in the form of Iran. The Palestinian issue was conveniently forgotten. Until recently, Saudi Arabia, UAE and all the Sunni powers here, they kept publicly backing the Palestinian position. Even today, their public position is that they back the Palestinian rights. But the reality is that they've already established their own peace with Israel, and the rivalry had ended long back. In the 1980s itself, rivalry between Saudi Arabia, UAE and Israel had been brought to an end with the intervention of the US. So since then, they were working together, but behind the scenes. But in 2020, just 2 years back, there was a very, very big development that happened. There was a huge development that took place in West Asia. It was the signing of the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were signed in 2020, which was mediated by then US President Donald Trump. What Donald Trump did was to bring US, Israel, UAE and Saudi Arabia closer and to strengthen their position against Iran. The US mediated between these countries and convinced UAE to recognize Israel officially for the first time. So in 2020, the Abraham Accords were signed, which was mediated by US, by then President Donald Trump. It was an agreement signed between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The UAE couldn't have signed this agreement without the approval of Saudi Arabia. Because publicly, just to please the Muslim population in the region, these countries, these autocratic states, they still had a position against Israel. They still were publicly claiming to support the Palestinian issue, even though they were secretly having a very strong relationship with Israel and US. But now Donald Trump convinced UAE, with the approval of Saudi Arabia, to formally recognize Israel. So this made UAE the third Arab Muslim country to recognize Israel and establish ties with Israel. The first country was Egypt, as we discussed. Right? Egypt was the first country to do this back in 1979 when the Camp David Accords were signed. Then it was Jordan in 1994. So the two key neighbors of Israel had ended their hostility and rivalry and they had established peaceful ties with Israel. For a long time, there was still some opposition in the Muslim world against Israel, and the US brought this to an end with a landmark transformation in 2020. So when the Abraham Accords were signed in 2020, it led UAE to recognize Israel, and this made UAE the third Arab Muslim country to recognize Israel. So since then, UAE and Israel have formally established their relations, and they are focusing on improving their economic, political and strategic relations. This massive geopolitical shift that happened into 2020 is what has led to the formation of I2U2. Because without this agreement, without the Abraham Accords, UAE and Israel themselves wouldn't have official diplomatic ties. Even though they had a secret close relationship, they didn't have formal relations. So Abraham Accords of 2020 played a critical role in bringing UAE closer to Israel. Along with this, after UAE recognized Israel, the Abraham Accords was also signed by another important Sunni power, that is Bahrain. Donald Trump convinced Bahrain as well to recognize Israel, sign the Abraham Accords and establish ties with Israel. So Bahrain became the fourth Arab Muslim country to recognize Israel. This was followed by other African countries, the other Muslim countries in North Africa, such as Morocco and Sudan. Even these African countries, they had boycotted Israel. You can see Sudan over here. You can see Morocco over here. Right? These African nations, which are Muslim majority nations, even they had boycotted Israel over the Palestinian issue. But now that UAE signed the Abraham Accords and recognized Israel, and now that Bahrain also signed the accord and recognized Israel, US convinced Sudan and Morocco also to recognize Israel. This was a landmark transformation that happened in West Asian geopolitics in the year 2020. Right? So this set the stage for the Sunni powers like UAE, Saudi Arabia to get closer to Israel. Officially, they could get closer. Right? But the fact is that even today, Saudi Arabia still doesn't officially have ties with Israel, but still it is already working closely with Israel, and all the other Sunni powers like Bahrain and UAE have already set up ties with Israel. So it's only a matter of time. Maybe in the next few years, even Saudi Arabia will very soon have official ties with Israel. So this is a landmark geopolitical transformation that has happened. So this opened the gates for US to further increase its influence and presence by bringing all its allies together. This is the very motive, the very agenda behind the I2U2 initiative. Recently, in fact, the White House issued a statement. Through the statement, the US said that the I2U2 focus is to strengthen American alliances, the existing American alliances in West Asia, which basically means that US is trying to further boost its ties with Israel, UAE, of course with Saudi Arabia and the Sunni world, and another major power of the region, which is India. Because India is a significant player in West Asia, right? India has significant influence. We have a very strong diaspora community, like I said. We have very strong economic relations with them. Our energy security is dependent on West Asia. And today, India is becoming a major trading partner and an investor as well for these countries, right? Those countries are looking at India as a big market, as an investment destination. So it's only natural for the West Asian countries to look at India as a close friend, as a strategic partner. So US, which has good ties with all of them, is trying to strengthen its alliances by bringing all of them together by focusing on the geoeconomics of the West Asia region. This is the rationale, this is the logic behind this new initiative, behind this new grouping. This is what brings these four countries together. So now that this big geopolitical transformation has happened, the I2U2 countries, they want to exploit this strategic and economic opportunity. They want to deepen their ties, deepen their economic relations, exploit each other's advantages, and create a complementary condition where they can draw from each other's strengths. For example, US is a strong military power. It has great military influence in West Asia. The US is a superpower. It's a major economy, one of the top economies of the world, right? Plus the US is a big market, a big investment destination. It's a big investor as well in these countries. Israel and UAE have their own strengths. Israel has technology. Israel is a leading military power of the region. It is also rumored that Israel possesses nuclear weapons. The UAE is a key West Asian power. It's an Emirati state. It's one of the leading members of the OPEC grouping that controls the oil markets of the world, the oil prices as well, right? So it's only natural for all these countries to come together, and they're roping India as well because India is a strategic partner for all of these countries, right? So with this initiative in mind, these four countries met last year, the foreign ministers met, and they had an interaction last year. The focus was on improving their economic relations. I2U2 is not more of a strategic grouping, it's more of an economic grouping. Whereas if you look at the Quad, the quadrilateral of the Indo-Pacific, it was set up as a strategic grouping, right? But today Quad has diversified into other economic areas as well. The Quad grouping of Indo-Pacific, it has moved beyond issues of strategic issues and maritime security, and it is focusing on biotechnology, it is focusing on healthcare, disaster management, it's focusing on emerging technologies like 5G, artificial intelligence, etc. So if Quad was a strategic group which transformed into a much more diversified economic group, I2U2 is the other way around. There is a strategic motive here, there is a future plan to focus on security issues as well, but the primary driving factor is the economic ties. The grouping has been formed to exploit the strengths of each other to build a strong economic partnership between these four countries so that they can dominate the West Asia region. So it's in this context that the first I2U2 summit was held last week, and the four countries, they have identified 6 important areas of cooperation. Please write down this point. They have identified 6 specific areas of cooperation. This includes water, energy security, transportation, space cooperation, cooperation in the field of healthcare, biomedicine and biotechnology, and as well as food security. All these are pressing issues for the four countries. Israel and UAE, they need water security. They are located in the middle of the desert. Today, climate change, global warming is aggravating the crisis. So they want to collaborate. They want to focus on climate-friendly economic development. India is craving energy security. We are heavily dependent on West Asia for our energy security. Plus, these countries, if they want to further bring their economies closer, they need to focus on connectivity. They need to improve transportation between them, right? Today, we are collaborating in the field of space technology as well. India, US, we already had a very close space collaboration. ISRO and NASA, they collaborate in various space projects. India and Israel also have a strong history of space collaboration. You guys might have heard about the RISAT satellite, right? The RISAT carries a payload called the synthetic aperture radar. It's a military satellite with a military application. It takes very high resolution pictures during all weather, during all time. This payload, this technology was developed by Israel, which was shared with India. Today, the RISAT series of satellites are the key military satellites we have for reconnaissance and surveillance. So India and Israel already have a history of close military and space cooperation. Similarly, India, UAE have also started focusing on space cooperation. The UAE wants to launch satellites into orbit, and it wants to rely on ISRO that provides very reliable and cheap launch options. So space is also emerging as an area of cooperation, and also healthcare, because the world is still in the middle of a pandemic, and this is where the countries can share their complementary strengths and their resources. As you know, India is the pharmaceutical hub of the world. India is called the pharmacy of the world. We have the world's largest drug and vaccine production industry. US has the technology, Israel has the technology, UAE has the money. So the idea is to bring all these together, the complementary strengths together, to benefit all these countries. US will pull in its capital, its military influence, diplomatic influence. It will bring in its technology as well. Israel will bring in its technology and military strength. UAE will bring the money that is needed, the capital that is needed. India can bring the innovation, the market that is needed. So by bringing the complementary strengths together, these four countries are hoping to create a strong strategic and economic grouping that focuses on West Asia. So that is why they have identified these 6 areas of cooperation. These are the priority areas: water security, energy security, transportation, basically connectivity, space cooperation, healthcare, biotech and biomedicine, and food security. Because in the future, food security would be a challenge due to climate change. Because of global warming, extreme weather events have gone up. Forest fires, droughts, floods have increased. This directly threatens agriculture. It threatens food security. So these are the areas where these four countries want to collaborate. They want to merge their private sector capital with the expertise they have, pool their resources together, their complementary strengths together, so that they can strengthen each other's infrastructure. They can modernize each other's infrastructure, explore a low carbon development path, focus on emission reduction, focus on sustainable development. These countries can truly help India in particular to scale up our infrastructure. They can use India's inherent strengths with regard to its human resource, with regard to its technology base, with regard to its manufacturing potential. They can groom that, cultivate that with their technology, their money and their investments, right? So this would be a win-win situation for all the four countries that are involved. So that is why I'm insisting that I2U2 is more of a grouping that's focused on the economics of it. It's focused more on geoeconomics than on geopolitics and the strategic aspects of the grouping. Of course, even that priority would come into picture later. Issues like defense, maritime security, military exercises, they might be added later. But the initial focus, as the summit has started, is on building a strong economic partnership. The focus is on geoeconomics of West Asia. They want to collaborate in other fields of emerging technologies as well. They want to lead the development of clean energy, renewable energy like solar, wind, nuclear and other hybrid forms of clean energy. They want to help each other in critical emerging technologies including 5G networks, artificial intelligence, robotics, etc. So this is where the true potential lies for I2U2. It definitely has the potential to transform West Asia and also to transform the relationship between these four countries. This is where I would like to highlight one important initiative that has been recently launched during the I2U2 Summit. During the first summit, a big initiative has been announced. UAE is going to lead this initiative. It is going to fund around $2 billion into India. It's going to pump more than $2 billion to set up food parks across India and to promote a hybrid renewable energy project in Gujarat. Please make a note of this, can be very important for prelims. UAE is bringing the capital needed to create food parks and food processing industry in India, to strengthen India's food processing potential and also to parallelly help India's agriculture. India can become the solution for providing food security to these countries, right? So the investments into our food processing industry could directly benefit the agri market, the agri sector in India. US and Israel, they can bring the technology that India needs. They can help India with better farming and agricultural technologies, with better irrigation technologies. So UAE is also looking at a clean renewable energy project to move away from the fossil fuels and to focus on a low carbon future. So this happens to be a major initiative, a very big initiative backed by UAE, and all the investments will happen in India. So that is how India stands to benefit. We can draw the capital from UAE, draw the technology from US and Israel and the resources from these countries to strengthen our inherent potential. This is in line with the ongoing investments that UAE has already made in India. You might have heard about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve Project, the Indian Strategic Petroleum Reserve Project. It's a very ambitious project that India has taken up. Under this, India is creating strategic petroleum reserves, which is basically large underground storage tanks where crude oil is being stored to create a buffer stock for India, a buffer stock of oil. This would be like a cushion which would shield and insulate India from any volatility in the global oil markets. If there are supply shocks, if there are price shocks with regard to oil supplies, right? India would be very vulnerable because we are largely dependent on oil imports. Nearly 85% of our oil requirement is met through imports. So any supply disruption or any disruption in oil prices, oil production directly hits the Indian economy. It will shoot up our import bill. So this is where India wants to create a buffer by building a buffer stock. Just like the Food Corporation of India maintains a food buffer stock to regulate the supply of essential food commodities, India is planning to create an underground storage buffer. Large underground storage tanks are coming up under the Strategic Petroleum Reserve project, and this is backed by UAE and Saudi Arabia. They both have invested in this ambitious project of India. Once completed, it will give India a buffer of close to 1 month. That is, without oil supplies, India can go on for at least 1 month without any external supplies. So that is a decent buffer for the Indian economy. Phase 1 of this project is already complete. Few massive underground storage strategic petroleum reserves have already come up at Mangalore, at Padur near Udupi, both of which are in Karnataka. There's one which has come up at Visakhapatnam in Andhra Pradesh. And under phase 2, there are many more strategic petroleum reserves coming up. These strategic projects are backed by UAE and Saudi Arabia. They're investing in these projects, and also they're supplying cheap crude oil to fill up these underground storage tanks. UAE and Saudi Arabia have also committed billions of dollars worth of investment into India in the infrastructure sector. So in line with this, UAE has already announced a new initiative under I2U2. It's going to invest $2 billion, more than that, into food processing and renewable energy into India. So this is how India stands to gain, and the initiative definitely presents numerous advantages for India, right? Apart from all the economic benefits, right? It allows India to easily build ties with Israel and the Arab countries. Back then, back in 1950s, 60s, 70s, etc., when Israel and Arab countries had intense rivalry going on, India had to make a very difficult choice. Since we were very dependent on the Arab states for oil, we were forced to keep Israel away. That is why between 1948 and 1992, India-Israel did not have any diplomatic relations. We did not have official diplomatic ties with Israel for almost 40 plus years because we were worried that Arab countries would retaliate against India and that could threaten our oil security, our energy security. It was only in 1992, under the Narasimha Rao government, that India-Israel formally established ties. Even after that, India always had to balance. It had to walk a geopolitical tightrope and balance its ties with the Arab Muslim nations and Israel. We were always worried that close ties with one would offend the other side. So going forward, we no longer have to do that because these countries themselves have already gotten closer. UAE itself has recognized Israel. Saudi Arabia is already close to Israel. So this is a huge relief for India. We need not balance the ties between Israel and the Arab Muslim countries. The next biggest advantage for India is that it will allow us to tap the strengths of all the three countries. It will help us attract investments from UAE, which has the required capital. The UAE can guarantee our energy security, which is a major oil producer. We can source the required technology from Israel across domains. And US can bring its military diplomatic influence into the region to stabilize the region. And the US market itself is a very attractive market for Indian companies and industries. And we can even source American technology through this platform. This is something that India stands to gain, and it will allow India to deepen its political and economic involvement in West Asia. It will allow us to protect all our interests, our political and economic interests, to protect the Indian diaspora, which faces many challenges over here. It allows India to secure its energy security, to draw investments and to boost our trade into West Asian countries. But along with these advantages, there are few challenges as well. And I would like to end my discussion on this note by talking about the challenges ahead for I2U2 and especially the challenges that lie ahead for India. So that would be the perfect ending for our discussion as well. See, the biggest challenge we're going to face with regard to I2U2 initiative is that it might create more problems for our ties with Iran. Like I mentioned earlier, all the other countries, Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia, US, they all have intense rivalry with Iran. They've all been targeting Iran's nuclear weapons program. US has even imposed sanctions, economic sanctions against Iran because of its nuclear weapons program. Israel has actively targeted Iran's nuclear program by assassinating Iranian scientists, by launching cyber wars and cyber attacks against Iranian nuclear plants. There is a covert war going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Sunni power countries. They are sponsoring terror groups against each other. So this is where India will find a challenge, because Iran is a close friend of India, but our ties with Iran has been affected because we have aligned more and more with US. In the last few years, India has abided by American sanctions against Iran. We have cut off oil imports from Iran. So Iran is already upset with India, and as we align more with US, UAE and Israel, Iran is going to be offended. Iran is going to be upset about it. So the challenge is, how will India balance this? Because Iran is equally important. India has made big investments in Iran, like the Chabahar port. Iran is crucial to access Afghanistan and Central Asia, right? We have many big connectivity projects planned with Iran. Iran can also be a very good source of oil supply, energy supply to India. So this is where India has to find that balancing act. It has to strike a balance between Israel and the Sunni powers on one side and Iran on the other side. Then comes the next big challenge, which is the Chinese presence in the region. As experts have said, this group is mainly designed to counter the Chinese influence. This is what few experts are saying, right? Even US has given an indication of this, because China has already become a major economic and strategic power across West Asia. See, China might have a direct rivalry with US. It might have many issues and border disputes with India. But China has very good relations with UAE, with Saudi Arabia, with Israel. China is already a big investor in West Asia, because even China relies heavily on West Asian oil. Just like India, China also imports most of its oil, and majority of it comes from West Asian countries. So to secure its energy security, China has invested heavily. It has many big infrastructure projects. Many of these countries have already joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. China has even increased its military presence in the Persian Gulf, near the Gulf of Aden and Strait of Hormuz. That is all around West Asia. China has enhanced its military presence. It has even opened its foreign naval base at an African country known as Djibouti, which is located right next to West Asia, across the Red Sea. So China has stepped up its economic and military presence, and it has emerged as a key player in West Asia. So countering the Chinese influence and balancing this act for India would be very, very challenging, because China is already targeting India for being part of the quadrilateral with Japan, Australia and US. So if China feels that India is aligning with US and other countries, and if it is seen to be countering China, then China might well retaliate against India. It might exert more pressure, trigger more border disputes, because China would see this as an alliance being created between India and US to corner China from all sides, from the east and from the west. So balancing this while countering Chinese aggression and influence is going to be a challenge, because this brings into question our principle of strategic autonomy, right? This is the very foundation of India's foreign policy. Since the days of Prime Minister Nehru, India has largely maintained an independent foreign policy. Our foreign policy has maintained the principle of strategic autonomy, where we make independent foreign policy choices. We usually don't ally with any country against another country. We don't join alliances. We don't take foreign policy decisions by force when we are pressured by other countries. But now this might come into question, because India will be seen as falling under American pressure and joining alliances like Quad and I2U2. So this might affect India's image. It might change the way Russia looks at India, for example. Russia is a close friend of India. But the way Russia looks at India might change if India keeps aligning more and more with US and US-backed groupings like Quad and I2U2. It might affect our ties with many other countries as well, and it might lead China to conclude that India is a hostile country aligning with US. So all these are very serious challenges that will come up. But if India were to balance this, then there are tremendous opportunities and advantages offered by the I2U2 platform. Like I said, it could become a dominant economic group with a strategic objective, and it could protect Indian interests across West Asia. So on this note, I would like to bring today's discussion to an end. I hope it was a fruitful discussion. I hope you have learned a lot of important details about West Asian geopolitics, and I hope you have understood the topic of I2U2 comprehensively and holistically. So if you found the initiative to be helpful, do let us know by pressing the like button. Share these videos and do post your comments as well in the comment section below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So thanks for being with me. Have a good night.